Okay, so in this video, we're going to go over how to graph sine and cosine. Okay, we're going to focus on identifying the amplitude and the period of both of these. We'll talk a little bit more about the shifts later. So first of all, we think of graphs in numbers. So let's make some decimals out of these numbers, and all we're going to do is type them into the calculator. Okay, so for cosine, remember that's our x value there. So at 0, our x value is 1 and our y value is 0. At pi over 6, our normal value is the square root of 3 over 2. And if we put that in decimal form, we're going to get 0.866. And 1/2 for our y. And we're going to get 0.5 for that. Pi over 4 is the square root of 2 over 2, and in decimal form, that is 0.707, and that's going to be the same for the y, since the x and the y at pi over 4 are the same. Pi over 6, we've got 1/2 as our x, which is 0.5 as a decimal, and then we got the square root of 3 over 2, which gives us 0.866. At 90, our x value is 0 and our y value is 1. At 180 or pi, it is -1, 0. And at 270, it is 0, -1. Okay, so that we could plot these things on a graph. So let's look at those two functions on a graph form. Okay, we're essentially unwrapping this unit circle and making it a graph. So the angle measure is going to go on the horizontal or the x-axis, and the trig value is actually going on the vertical or your y-axis. So the domain for both sine and cosine is going to be from -infinity to +infinity. Now the range stops. Remember, our unit circle has a value of 1 at the top and -1 at the bottom. So that's actually going to be our range from -1 to 1. Now remember, the inclusion brackets are more square, so make sure you have those. Okay, so those are the domain and range of both of those functions. So I'm going to put 1 at the top and -1 at the bottom, and we're going to deal with graphing these. Okay, we mostly graph always 5 points. Okay, and normally they start with the major ones around our unit circle. So at 0, right, the sine value at 0, if we go up and look at our chart, the sine value is 0. So we're going to put a point there at 0. At pi over 2, okay, the value is at 1. At pi, it's back at 0. At 3 pi over 2, it's at -1, and at 2 pi, it's back at 0. Notice that it makes this nice little accordion, okay? Looking, and the arrows, I mean, they technically go on forever, right? They go on forever because that's why the domain and range is from -infinity to +infinity. Now, those other values we put in, right, fall in between 0 and pi over 2 in our chart. So I'm going to draw my 3 lines there. The first one is pi over 6, and that value for sine was at 0.5, so it's halfway up there. And then the next one is at 0.07, so just slightly higher. And then pi over 3 is again slightly higher at 0.866. Right, so they just follow along the curve. Okay, just to keep that in mind. The cosine, okay, we're going to do cosine the same way. I'm going to put 1 at the top and negative 1 at the bottom, and we're going to start at 0. Cosine that 0 starts at 1, so this graph is actually going to start at the top. And then it's going to come down to 0 at pi over 2, negative 1 at pi, 0 at 3 pi over 2, and back to 1 at 2 pi. And technically these are going on forever, so I'll put my little arrows there. Okay, now every graph, cosine graph that you draw in this class will look like that. It might be a little steeper, it could be narrower, it could be wider, but it's going to generally look like that. It might loop to the left or the right. The same thing with that sine function. It's going to always look like this, and there's always going to be 5 points. It might be wider, it might be skinnier, okay? But it will always look like that. That will be the shape, okay? So let's sketch the following graph, but for this given interval, okay? So negative pi is back this way. So we've got negative pi, and please realize that we're using the pi over 2 as our increment. So if there's negative pi here, this is going to be negative pi over 2, and then we'll end up at 0. And then we'll have pi over 2, and then we'll have pi, and then we'll have 3 pi over 2. Okay, I chose my increment based off of what they gave me there. Okay, so, and we go up to 1 and down to negative 1. So at negative pi, what is the sine value? It's going to be 0, so we're going to start here on 0. And then at negative pi over 2, right, we would have a value of negative 1. And then at 0, we'd have a value of 0. At pi over 2, we've got a positive 1. At pi, we've got 0. And then at 3 pi over 2, we're back down to negative 1. Remember, negative pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2 are coterminal angles. This is why they both have that value of negative 1. Okay, and then I'm just going to draw in my graph from there. I'm going to put my little arrows on there. Okay, again, it's still got that accordion shape. Okay. Let's look at this for cosine, right? We got a different interval here. We're going from negative pi over 2 to 3 pi. Again, my increment, I'm still going to use pi over 2 because it's easy. So pi over 2, or negative pi over 2 is on the left side, and then I've got my 0. And then I'm going to have pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, 5 pi over 2, 3 pi. Oops, I don't know why I put a 6. Okay. So at negative pi over 2, cosine is going to start at 0, right? Because we're not going to have any value there. I need to put in my 1 and my negative 1. And then cosine at 0 goes to 1. And then it goes down to 0 at pi over 2, and then the value at pi is negative 1. Value at 3 pi over 2 is 0. The value at 2 pi is 1. 5 pi over 2 is going to be back down at 0. And then 3 pi is going to be back down at negative 1. Again, it follows the same general pattern, okay, and that pattern is not going to change. So if it's going up, it's going to start to go down, okay? All right, so here we've got the general form of these. Those were just using sine and cosine without any transformations. So here are the formulas with transformations. Notice that we've got an A, okay, a B, a C, and a D. All of these are going to affect the equation somehow, and we are going to discuss those a little bit today, and then some of them we're not going to do until later, and some of them we're going to work with the functions in immediately. Okay, so the A here is going to affect the amplitude, okay? This is the scaling factor that's vertically going to stretch or compress our graph. So the A is affecting the amplitude, how high or how small it's going to get. Now, if A has a negative in front, okay? If there's a negative, it causes the graph to flip. Oops. Okay, so like the cosine function normally starts at 1. If it was a negative cosine, we would no longer start at 1. We would flip over the axis and start at negative 1. Now 0 does not flip because the inverse of 0 is just 0. Okay? The period which is how we're going to decide what our interval at the bottom is going to be, is affected by 2 pi over b. Now this is for sine and for cosine. We're going to have some different ones for some of our different functions, but this is, again, for our sine and cosine. Okay, so if that value of b is between the numbers 0 and 1. Remember, that is a fraction. Oh my goodness. The period is going to stretch. If it's greater than 1, the period will shrink. So those are whole numbers, okay? Then we have the horizontal shift and the vertical shift. These are what we're going to talk about on separate note sheets, but I just wanted to give it to you as a heads up. C over B moves the graph horizontally, so left or right, and then the vertical shift moves the graph vertically, so up or down. So let's sketch one period of this graph. Okay, so we just got to figure out some things. Okay, so our A value here is 2, okay, because it's out in front. The A is always positive. Remember, we had those absolute values on it, so it's always positive. Okay, the period we're going to get by taking 2 pi and dividing it by our B value. So right up here, we're going to write B, which ended up being 4. So we're going to take 2 pi and divide it by 4, and we're going to simplify that, which we're going to get pi over 2. Okay, so that means our entire period, so the entire time it takes it to go through its normal cycle, okay, and for cosine, that is that V-shaped graph, okay, because we identified this one as a cosine function. We're going to make sure our graph looks like that. So we're going to start by putting the amplitude on here, okay, so I'm going to go 1, 2, 1, 2, because my amplitude is now 2 and not 1. My period, I'm ending at pi over 2. So I'm going to put pi over 2 out here. And I know that I'm starting at 0. So what is halfway between pi over 2 and 0? Okay, so if we take that and divide it by 2, we're going to get that pi over 4. Okay. And then halfway between pi over 4 and 0 is pi over 8. And we can use that to count, right? So pi over 8, 2 pi over 8 is pi over 4, and then 3 pi over 8 is in the middle. You could also, again, take pi over 2, add it to pi over 4, and divide it by 2 as well. But now we've got our interval, and we're doing cosine, and cosine always starts up at the top at 1. But our amplitude is now 2, so we're not starting at 1, we're starting at 2. And then the next time it goes down to 0, and then it goes all the way down to the bottom, so for us it's at negative 2, and then up to 0, and up to 2. Again, this pattern is always, I missed my dot, is always the same. Okay, again, the cosine graph will always look like this. Now, if I had drawn this to scale, right, this graph would have shrunk. It would have gotten a lot smaller than our normal one because our normal graph period is 2 pi, where this is only pi over 2, which is a quarter of 2 pi, so it would have gotten a lot smaller. All right, so this one here, right, has a negative. So I always circle my negative, and I tell myself that I need to flip it. So I don't forget, this is a cosine, so I know it generally has this shape, but I see that negative, so it's going to be flipped, and it's going to come like that. Okay? So my amplitude is 2. It's always positive. Do not give me a negative. It is not negative. Okay, and the period, again, is 2 pi divided by our b. Well, b here looks a little confusing, right? There's technically a 1 next to the x, so b is 1/2. So we're dividing by 1/2. I know dividing by fractions is difficult for us, so I'm going to do it down here on the bottom. So we've got 2 pi over 1, right? That's its fraction. And then you flip the bottom. So 2 over 1 gives us 4 pi. So our period is going to be 4 pi. Okay, my amplitude again was 2. So I got to put that on here. I'm starting at 0. So what is halfway between 4 and 0? That would be 2 pi. Okay, and between 0 and 2 pi is just pi, so our interval is pi. So over here we've got 3 pi. Now again, this one was flipped. So normally our graph would be this graph here in the black. That's what our normal graph would look like. But because we have now flipped it, we're going to take the opposite. So we're now not starting at positive 2, we're starting at negative 2. 0 stays the same. Okay, the negative 2 becomes a positive 2. And now the red graph is what we see. Okay, so the red graph is the correct one. That's what happens when it's negative. Okay. All right, so we've got a sine function here. Okay, so I know that tells me I'm starting at 0. Okay, my amplitude is 3. My period, right, is everything next to our x. So our b is 4 pi. Okay, so we're going to take 2 pi and divide 4 pi. And when we do that, the pi's cancel and we'll get 1/2. So we've got a fraction. Okay, so now I'm going to come down here to my graph. So I got negative 3 and positive 3. And I know that I'm ending out here with 1/2. So halfway between 1/2 and 0 is 1/4. And halfway between 1/4 and 0 is 1/8. Okay, and then here we'll have our 3/8 because we counted by 8. Okay, we started with the sine function, which means we're starting at 0, and then it goes all the way to the top, and then back down to 0, all the way to the bottom, back up to 0, and we draw in our graph. Okay? For the last one here, we've got A being 3/2, and we've got a flip happening. So our graph normally for sine does one of these numbers. So we went to the top first. So this time it's going to go, it's still going to start at 0 because you don't flip 0, but it's going to go down and then back up. So our period here is being affected by a b of pi. So 2 pi divided by pi is just 2. So we have 2 out here and 3/2. So 3/2 is in the middle. So halfway between 0 and 2 is 1. Halfway between 1 and 2 is, or 1 and 0 is 1/2. And then halfway between 1 and 2 is 3/2. So again, we've flipped the original. So I'm going to draw the original here in black so we can see the original. Okay, so the original would look like this. Okay, now I'm going to draw the new one, and we're still going to start there at 0, but instead of going up, we're going to go down and then back up. Okay, so the flipped one is there in blue. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you need it for the first time or for the second time, if you have any other questions, please see me in class. I'm more than willing to answer those.